Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, good to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Good. Chris, I'd like to talk a little bit today about stagflation. We talked a lot about stagflation back in the 70s. Nobody wants to mention it now because that would imply that there's inflation and a weak economy, and that couldn't possibly be the case because that would indicate that the Federal Reserve would have to adjust and maybe not print so much money, maybe not keep interest rates at 0%. So they have to convince the people that there is no inflation, no stagflation, economic growth is doing well, but that's just because they're managing the economy real well. But I want to just read the title of an article that Zero Hedge had yesterday. New home sales collapse in April as median prices soar. Now that describes what stagflation would be like, that there would be decreased sales, a weak economy, and still have inflation. In the 70s were notorious for this. The economy was considered very weak, but the stock market was also very weak. But today they're very interested in keeping the stock market up, and they're hysterical about it, and that is why not only did they bail out the economy and the stock market with QEs, they're maintaining zero rate interest. To me, the amazing thing is, if the economy is doing as great as our administration tells us, and that the only thing they need to make it, to tinker with a little bit more, is to get more inflation, to get the prices to rise a little bit. And that's the only thing. So they're arguing the case that they need to keep the printing presses going. And then if the economy is doing so well, this is not the time they scream and holler for tariffs. They did that in our depression. But no, there's no weakness at all, but we're now having a big trade war going on. And also, you know, I understand they're spending more money than we have in Washington. The deficits are very high. And yet the whole effort of the administration and all the politicians, practically all the leadership, whether it's domestic spending or international spending, they want more, more, more. So in one sense, the policies are designed as if the economy is collapsing and in difficulties, and yet they say, no, the economy is perfect, everybody is fully employed. But if you read shadow stats, this employment that exists today is not exactly, as good as it may seem or as they predict. So I sort of work in my own mind on the assumption that there's a lot of inflation. There's a lot of printed money, and there's your inflation. There's a lot of harm done from the inflation, and the economy is not quite as rosy as has been indicated. And everything we hear about, all the fibs and lies and distortions, is designed for one reason, and that is to make sure the Fed doesn't even get tempted to raise interest rates. There was a time when a Federal Reserve usually acted a little bit independently and they'd raise rates and play these games. But it's not happening this time, and there's an aggressive approach, and it's all, and most of the people in the financial markets, or at least in Wall Street, they're quite pleased with this. But if they look carefully, they would realize that, you know, even the Dow Jones is not much higher, and no, it's not even higher than it was back in January of last year. It's like 1,000 points lower. So the stock markets aren't as rosy as there's this pretense, but there sure is a determination that they keep the rates low. And the one thing they don't want people to know about is there's stagflation, and that there's a lot of inflation in different areas, and all inflations are different. Inflation just means things are going up, prices are going up, but that doesn't mean that you can measure all the bad effects of inflating the currency by watching the CPI, which is rigged by the government. So the distortions are there. It is fake economic news is what I call it. Chris?
That's right, Dr. Paul. Washington is filled with big lies. We saw it with Russiagate. That was a big lie. But, you know, President Trump did the same thing with his greatest economy ever. It's just a big lie that's repeated over and over. But the economy is in such bad shape that the Fed couldn't even raise rates above 2% without breaking everything. And we have record debts, trillion-dollar deficits. I mean, when the economy's good, you pay off your debts. You increase your savings. It's the exact opposite. So when a severe recession hits, we're starting off at the worst place that we've ever been. So President Trump should have stayed honest like he was when he campaigned, but he didn't.
Well, in our title, Chris, we infer, and I firmly believe this is the case, it's all the Fed's fault. Of course, indirectly, it's the fault of many others. It's the fault of the university professors. It's the fault of Keynes and all the philosophic mischief that created this. But each time we got into trouble, they just had to do more and more. If deficit spending is okay, as they would say, that you keep doing that, you keep printing money and deficit finance, and you get out of trouble. But until it doesn't work anymore. But that is what they're doing. There's no question in Washington that spending has to be increased. Nobody wants anything cut. And I think that they want the spending foreign and domestic. And I think about the dangers of our liberties are both foreign and domestic. Well, our inflation, they're foreign and domestic because that's where the spending is, and nobody, that brings the coalition together. So when you have the economic authoritarians that are in our universities, you shouldn't worry about it. Matter of fact, the supply siders have participated in this. They still take the position, don't sweat the deficit. What you want is economic growth. Well, I was always for the economic growth and cutting the taxes and having a sound currency, but to say that you can't and shouldn't deal with the spending. But that was one of the things that really helped the Republicans over the last several decades, is they de-emphasized cutting spending. It used to be that the Democrats were well known for promoting all the big spending, especially domestically, and they would promote this, but then they would come along and the Democrats would get the credit for giving all these goodies away, but then the Republicans came along and they were conservative and say the deficits are bad, which I agreed with. And also, there's been some in the conservative libertarian movement that argued that the deficits are so bad that you can't ever quit doing it, because you have to. The deficits are bad, and you don't have to cut spending. You just have to. It invites this raising taxes. So a lot of liberals agree with us that we shouldn't have these deficits, but they're not for. They might say they're for raising taxes, but they're really not. They're for the system, the Fed. The Fed comes in and they accommodate, because this is sort of work to some degree. It tides things over. This last one, though, people forget so quickly. It's been 10 years, but 5 years out of that recession when QE was being used, nobody knew what was going on. It's just, memories are short. It's just these past couple of years where the statisticians have been able to preach to us, everything is okay, everybody's fully employed, there's more jobs than people out there. And but the goal is one thing: justify the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low. The mandate for the Fed is to have low unemployment, have people employed, and stable prices, and at the same time to manipulate interest rates, keep interest rates stay steady. In other words, license to steal. And so that wasn't even in the original mandate in the Federal Reserve, but that is accepted. And that's the number one thing they do, is they manipulate interest rates to fool the people, to tide it over to help people, and that's what happened. And then Wall Street gets helped, and others, the people who have access to this money. And it contributes, of course, to the discrepancy in income with rich and poor, which is a source of our spending and monetary policy on how we run this.
Right, Dr. Paul, and you made a great point that the Fed didn't know what they were doing when they, during the last downturn. So they printed trillions and trillions of dollars, called it QE. They were hailed as heroes on the magazine covers for saving the economy. They didn't save the economy. They just made a much bigger bubble. And President Trump even pointed that out when he was running. And but they said that it was just going to be temporary. We were going to buy these government bonds and junky mortgage-backed securities, and then we'll roll it off and go back to normal. Well, we're finding out they're not going back to normal. We're at still around $1 trillion they have on their balance sheet. And what's going to be next when they do their next QE? $8 trillion on their balance sheet. So, and what's going to happen around the world when the rest of the world sees, these people, they're not going to stop printing this money. It's not going to be good.
Right. And, I remember the 70s very well because I've told the story about how I got involved in speaking out on this. Was after the Bretton Woods broke down in August of 1971. But as that led into, wage and price controls, as a matter of fact, in 71, the inflation wasn't nearly as bad as it turned out to be, but they were putting on wage and price controls in the business community. They were all for this, and they were raising, import taxes, so they thought this was a good thing at the beginning. But ultimately, though, there was a lot of expression of amazement. They were befuddled. The economy is doing poorly. And the way we've been taught is when the economy is poor, prices drop. Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes prices go up. All you have to do is think about the extreme of stagflation, and that's depression, and that's what's happening in Venezuela. Yeah, there's plenty of money and prices are going up, but if rising prices are so good, why wouldn't they be doing very well, in countries that are further along? But the wage and price controls obviously make a mess of things, and this whole idea that they've preached this now for years, several years now, that they have people hone in the financial community, you look at it all the time, that the most beneficial thing to give the economy a little more boost is that price inflation would go up. Well, what if the standard of living doesn't go up? What if real wages don't go up? But the 2% inflation rate, it is the craziest thing I think anybody ever invented. That the whole design, not stability in the currency, in the dollar. That's what they should be doing, dealing with stability in the currency. No, they want prices to go up now. And some say that what we're doing is we're having deflation. And we can't allow deflation, and because they can point out where somebody's maybe prices went down because of technology, but the deflation is just a gimmick to try to make sure that the Federal Reserve has cover to continue to print their money. But the people who understood this in the 70s knew exactly what they should be doing, but they didn't do, and it took a long time, and it finally ended after 10 years of this. But right now we're looking at the same old problems coming, and I think that our problem is much worse than they're willing to admit, and that we're in the early stages of stagflation. And they say, Ron, you talk about that all the time, and there's inflation. Well, there's inflation of the money supply. They don't want to use that as a definition, but they say we have to look at prices, and they look at consumer price in the index. Well, that's rigged, and it's not universal for everybody. If you're on minimum income, your CPI might be going up faster than somebody else's. But overall, if you looked at the broad economy, what about the prices of medical care? What about the prices of education, where government gets really involved, in the system? Those prices are soaring. And so there's a lot of inflation out there. But that is to be understood. That's a characteristic of inflation of the money supplies. It will push prices up, but they're unpredictable. And sometimes they'd hardly even move. But then where does the money go if you don't see people paying more for what they're buying? Well, maybe it will go into buying stuff they don't really need and misleading people. Because the key to all this system and understanding it and getting to a sound economy, the key is the manipulation of the interest rates. Before it was unemployment, they tinkered with that, and they tinkered with stable prices. But the tool is manipulating interest rates, and that is going to be recorded sometime in economic history, that this whole thing of QE and this idea that you can take interest rates down to 1 and then talk about negative interest rates as a solution to the problem of manipulating interest rates. And that is just absolutely astounding that they're going to do this. So there's trouble ahead. I think what we're going to get is more of what we read on that headline. People aren't buying as much, but the prices are still going up. But the one thing is, it's not universal. One person said, well, if they print too much money and prices go up, what's the difference? Big difference is some people's prices go up, other people's prices don't go down. And the other thing, real wages never keep up with the prices that people pay, the average person pays. But it is always beneficial to those dealing in the monetary system, and that is the friends of the Federal Reserve and those who like the money, the liberals and the Democrats, to monetize our debt and to monetize all this spending. And so it is a fantastic gimmick. But the one thing is it is not long lasting. You say, well, it's lasted quite a while now. Well, the real fiat currency monstrosity has happened since '71, which is pretty long. But if economic history is worth a nickel or a penny, this will end. And big thing is, people immediately say, when I talk about this issue, they say, when? Tell me when it's going to happen. I want to short the market. Well, the best answer for exactly when is unknown. All we know is there's fragility out there. There were quite a few of us that talked about the housing bubble and the NASDAQ bubble, but we had no idea what year it would happen. But one thing we do know is every single day we get closer to that day that we will have to deal with it. Chris?
Right, Dr. Paul. I'll finish by echoing what you said. Central planning just does not work. The Fed is not the first idea of central planning economy. It's been done so many times, and it has failed 100% of the time. And it's because ultimately the planners, they corner themselves. They reach the point where every move that they make is wrong, everything they say is wrong, everything they think is wrong, and nothing that they do makes anybody happy. And it's at that point that new ideas, it all breaks apart in their minds of what they thought government and the Fed was. And that's when the ideas of free markets, sound money, and individual liberty will have a fighting chance.
Very good. And I'll close with answering a question I get asked a lot. If I were in the Federal Reserve or they would listen, what would one thing I advise them to do? Because they say, well, they haven't even audited Fed yet, and they're not going to get rid of the Fed like you like. So what if we had more control over policy, what would you do to help move things along in our direction? And that is eliminate the authority and the power for the Federal Reserve to be a counterfeiter and to rig interest rates. If they can manipulate interest rate and increase the money supply, they could be restricted. When the Fed was first started, as bad of an idea as it wasn't anything with like what was going on now. They might look like hard money people back from the 1913, but now it is this whole thing. If we could restrain the FOMC from manipulating interest rates and pretending that they have the knowledge to know what interest rates should be, and yet it's nothing more than accommodating, and listening to the deep state to finance the big state, and that is the liberals and conservatives who are not fighting the battle against spending, because unless they direct it in that attention, they don't have a lot of sincere concern about personal liberty, and that's my concern. So personal liberty cannot be enhanced unless we look very seriously at the Federal Reserve and explain why we should end the Fed. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.